Picture a candlelit archive beneath the Vatican, air thick with the scent of dust and beeswax. Rows of chained books, parchment frayed at the edges, their ink faded to brown veins. Among them lies a single volume bound in black goatskin, stamped not with a title but a sigil, two intersecting triangles and the faint outline of a serpent swallowing its own tail. The librarian whispers its name only once, the Ars Volatilis. This is where Valac first appears, not as a demon of horror films but as a fragment in a medieval grimoire catalogued in 1620. His entry is short, almost an afterthought. The 62nd spirit is Valac, a president of hell, who cometh on two great serpents and beareth the form of a fair child with angels' wings. A child with wings, hardly the monstrous nun that haunted movie screens. Yet every archivist who handled this text recorded something strange. Some complained of migraines, others said they heard faint whispering in Latin when they turned the page. One scholar, Father Antonius Del Rio, refused to read the description aloud after claiming the letters began to move. Centuries later, that same passage would be marked with a crimson symbol by the Vatican's Section X, a real clerical department created in the 1940s to review and suppress texts associated with psychological contamination through ritual language. Internal memos, later uncovered by researchers through leaked archives, showed Section X had cross-referenced the Ars Volatilis with newly declassified CIA files on metaphysical pattern recognition. The connection was not accidental. The Vatican and American intelligence shared a quiet, unnerving interest, why certain symbols and names seemed to trigger measurable changes in perception. Among those names, none appeared more frequently or mysteriously than Valac. As our investigation unfolds, we'll trace Valac's journey from obscure medieval text to modern mythology, from whispered liturgy to weaponized psychology. But to understand how a name became a force, we first need to understand what names really do. When a word survives across centuries, it's never by accident. The name Valac wasn't just preserved, it was protected. In old Aramaic glossaries, the root Vilk translates roughly to split in voice or divided utterance. Scholars at Oxford's Department of Medieval Philology once proposed it referred to a linguistic phenomenon, words that, when spoken aloud, altered a listener's emotional rhythm. But the Church saw it differently. To them, Valac was more than a name, it was a frequency. In 1953, a memo circulated through the newly formed Psychological Strategy Board, a U.S. intelligence think tank. The document, now partially declassified, detailed phonetic sequences of psychological resonance. Among the tested sequences was a single word recorded in multiple languages: Arabic, Latin, Hebrew, and a crude phonetic English. The analysts noticed a consistent response: elevated heart rate, mild disorientation, and a lingering sense of being observed. The word Valac. The Vatican's Section X had warned them decades earlier. Names, they wrote, are containers. Speak them without context and you activate the vessel. The CIA didn't believe in demons, but they believed in results. For them, Valac wasn't a creature, it was a code, a psychological catalyst, something that could bend human perception when invoked under the right conditions. One of the few surviving recordings from those experiments, Project Morningstar 1955, captures a male voice reading ancient incantations in a monotone tone. Halfway through, the recording cuts abruptly. The next frame of the transcript reads only, subject became unresponsive. Session terminated. But beneath the fear and secrecy lies something even more intriguing. Every ancient source, Greek, Sumerian, Ethiopian, describes Valac not as a destroyer but as a revealer, the so-called president of hidden treasures. His function was to uncover what's buried: gold, secrets, or the parts of the human mind that prefer to stay unseen. If that's true, then maybe the danger wasn't in speaking his name, but in listening to what it unlocks. The question that haunted both priests and analysts was never who is Valac, it was why does his name still work? Imagine this, an illuminated manuscript found in a monastery in northern Spain after the fall of Franco's regime. The ink shimmered faintly under ultraviolet light, revealing a dual image: a child wrapped in serpents, eyes painted gold. Underneath, written in a hand unfamiliar to Latin scholars, the caption read, Lux divisa, the divided light. To theologians, this was blasphemy. To psychologists decades later, it was symbolism, an ancient attempt to represent the fractured human mind, the duality of innocence and danger, the same duality that defines Valac's earliest depictions. In some accounts, he appears as a cherub, in others, a serpent, two forms, one purpose: to test perception itself. During the 1970s, Dr. Miriam Lesko, a Jungian scholar working with declassified anthropology materials, stumbled upon field notes written by operatives from the U.S. Psychological Warfare Division. The notes described West African and South American rituals involving child-masked initiates entwined with serpentine patterns. Participants claimed to experience visions of radiant children whispering truth. Lesko cross-referenced the descriptions with early grimoires and found direct parallels with Valac's imagery. Her paper, Archetype of the Serpentine Child, argued that Valac wasn't a demon at all, but a mythic container for transformation, a symbol of confronting forbidden knowledge. The church burned her research in 1982 after labeling it theological contamination. And yet the same year, Hollywood optioned a horror script whose antagonist bore an uncanny resemblance to her archetype, a pale childlike figure surrounded by serpents haunting the guilty. The studio changed the name to avoid religious controversy, but insiders whispered that the screenwriter had somehow read Lesko's banned material. It was this cinematic mutation that later inspired The Conjuring 2 and The Nun. But here's the irony: the real Valac, if the ancient texts are to be believed, wasn't a creature of darkness. He was a guide through it. His serpents didn't represent evil, they represented knowledge coiled upon itself. So how did a figure once associated with enlightenment become Hollywood's emblem of terror? The answer lies not in religion or myth, but in intelligence archives and the one experiment meant to quantify faith itself. In 1978, behind a nondescript brick building on the outskirts of Langley, Virginia, a covert division known only as Project Meridian began what internal documents called belief modulation trials. The premise was deceptively simple: could faith, religious, symbolic, or mythic, be measured, replicated, and induced? On paper, Meridian's goal was to study collective belief structures to predict social movements, but the personnel list read like a cross between a theology symposium and a seance. Among the participants, cognitive linguist Dr. Ernest Fowley, Jesuit defector Father Lucas Ferrero, and an unnamed ritual systems consultant from Eastern Europe. The consultant's code name, Valac. That detail alone sent chills through later historians. VLK, Valac, was it coincidence or deliberate code? Recordings from those sessions, now partially declassified, paint a surreal picture. Volunteers were placed in sensory isolation chambers and instructed to repeat sigils, geometric word forms derived from grimoires, while being monitored by EEG and galvanic response devices. Over 60% of subjects reported auditory hallucinations within 10 minutes. Many claimed to see a small, radiant figure. Others said the walls breathed. Father Ferrero's handwritten notes describe one subject who entered what he called hypersuggestive lucidity. When asked what he saw, the man whispered, "A child with wings. It asked me what I fear most and then showed it to me." Within weeks, Project Meridian was shut down. The official reason: unreliable data and participant instability. Unofficially, an incident occurred during session 47 that remains redacted in every file. The only surviving annotation reads, "Phase threshold reached, verbal containment protocols failed." Years later, Dr. Fowley broke his silence in a letter to a colleague. "We were not summoning anything," he wrote. "We were amplifying belief until it became autonomous." That was the turning point. From that day forward, intelligence agencies began treating faith, mythology, and symbolism not as cultural relics but as technologies of influence. And at the center of their research always was the figure of Valac, the entity that seemed to appear whenever belief crossed the threshold from idea to reality. A decade after Project Meridian was shuttered, a quiet discovery was made in an abandoned monastery near Avignon. Hidden inside a hollowed altar stone wrapped in decayed silk was a manuscript titled Evangelium Umbri, the Gospel of Shadows. Its ink shimmered faintly blue, a pigment that modern analysis later identified as lapis mixed with trace amounts of mercury. The text, dated to the late 1400s, described a celestial being named Valacil, the whisper between worlds. The Gospel's verses didn't portray him as infernal at all. Instead, Valacil was depicted as the messenger of dual minds, a luminous child who taught humankind how to speak to their own shadow. The text claimed that before the fall of Babel, there was a single language that allowed thought to shape matter, a language of resonance. But when it fractured, certain words retained fragments of its original power. One of those words was Valacil. When the Vatican's Section X recovered the text, they classified it immediately under symbolic contagion risk. A memo from 1989 warned, "Terminology associated with Valacil produces psychosomatic responses in trained clergy. Recommend indefinite containment." Yet a copy escaped. An anonymous scholar, later identified as a linguistics professor named Dr. Elias Crane, translated portions of the manuscript into English. His notes, smuggled into a private archive in Geneva, contained a chilling observation: Valac is not a demon's name, it is an invocation command, a phonetic key designed to harmonize opposites within the psyche. Crane hypothesized that the child with wings represented the conscious mind, while the serpent symbolized the subconscious, the twin forces of will and instinct. The union of both, he wrote, could create a state of awareness so intense it manifested phenomena mistaken for the supernatural. When Crane vanished in 1993, his apartment was left undisturbed except for one thing, a spiral sigil drawn in chalk on the wall, identical to the one found in the Ars Volatilis. No one ever claimed his research. Through these fragments, one truth began to emerge. Valac wasn't an external monster. He was a mirror held up to human consciousness, a reflection of what happens when knowledge and fear occupy the same space. By the early 2000s, intelligence strategy had evolved beyond war and ideology. The new frontier was emotion. Controlling what populations feared, desired, and believed became the holy grail of psychological influence. Inside this framework emerged a covert initiative known as Project Seraphim, a collaboration between defense contractors, behavioral economists, and entertainment executives. Its stated mission: study mass response to symbolic stimuli under conditions of induced uncertainty. But the pattern was familiar. Among the declassified terms used in Seraphim's briefing papers was one that shouldn't have been there at all: VALAC protocol, shorthand for value activation code. The term referenced a model that mapped fear-based responses to linguistic triggers, a direct descendant of Project Meridian's belief modulation trials. Documents obtained through a 2012 leak revealed something astonishing. The same archetypal imagery associated with Valac, serpents, children, and luminous eyes, was being used in experimental marketing, political branding, and social media algorithms. These weren't coincidences, they were deliberate psychological anchors, tested for decades to evoke specific emotional reactions. One analyst, speaking anonymously, claimed, "The symbols that once lived in ritual circles now live in your advertisements." He explained that every recurring symbol or tone, when repeated often enough, reshapes how people feel about power, safety, and truth. In other words, belief engineering. What's most haunting is that many of these techniques trace back to the same occult blueprints first studied under the guise of demonology. The CIA once called it magical thinking. Corporate strategists rebranded it as behavioral engagement. The mechanics remained identical: repetition, symbol exposure, communal participation, and ritualized emotion. In a closed symposium at MIT's Media Lab, one presentation titled Archetypal Resonance and Consumer Retention displayed a slide bearing a familiar symbol, two serpents crossing beneath a pair of wings. The attendees laughed at the coincidence, but the presenter's final words silenced the room: symbols don't need believers, they just need repetition. It's here that Valac's presence transcended religion and entered commerce. He was no longer a demon in the shadows, but the algorithm behind every flickering screen, the silent architect of the modern fear economy. In 2015, a neuropsychologist named Dr. Helena Rourke began an independent study she called the Mirror Cognition Project. Her goal was to explore how self-recognition in altered states might enhance creativity. What she didn't realize was that her experiment would accidentally recreate a centuries-old ritual once associated with Valac. Dr. Rourke's method was deceptively simple. Subjects were placed alone in a dimly lit room with a single mirror and a candle behind them. They were asked to stare at their reflection for 20 minutes while repeating an affirmation designed to bypass rational thought. The phrases were derived from old ritual scripts she had found in a forgotten anthropology journal, texts she believed to be harmless folk incantations. Within days, participants began reporting identical phenomena. First came facial distortion, subtle at first, then profound. Eyes widening, mouth shifting, features melting into unrecognizable forms. Some saw multiple faces layered over their own. Others claimed to see a child with wings behind the glass. Dr. Rourke initially dismissed these accounts as pareidolia, the brain's tendency to find patterns in chaos, but then she tried it herself. In her private notes, later published posthumously, she wrote, "The reflection changed, not into a monster, but into something calm, luminous, and impossibly sad. It whispered a name that sounded like Valac or Velacil. The voice wasn't external, it was mine, but not mine." 2 weeks later, Rourke disappeared from her apartment in Prague. Police found her research materials intact, save for one mirror, shattered from the inside. Psychologists reviewing her experiment noted that prolonged mirror gazing under low light induces a mild dissociative state. Yet none could explain why subjects across continents, using different languages, all described seeing the same entity, a winged child surrounded by serpentine shadows. Some occult historians suggested Rourke had accidentally rediscovered a ritual once performed by Renaissance magi to call the divided light. Others believe her experiment demonstrated what Valac truly represents: the mind's instinct to manifest its hidden contents once confronted with silence. If the mirror ritual taught us anything, it's that Valac doesn't need belief to appear. He only needs a moment of reflection, literal or otherwise, to emerge from the space between perception and fear. In 2018, 3 years after Dr. Rourke's disappearance, a field researcher for the British Psychical Society named Thomas Cade began investigating a series of strange linguistic phenomena in rural Croatia. Villagers reported a young boy who spoke backwards, full sentences that, when recorded and reversed, formed coherent speech. The content of these reversed phrases was what unsettled investigators. Passages from grimoires thought lost to time, including the Ars Volatiles and fragments of the Gospel of Shadows. Cade's first visit to the child's home was documented on a small handheld camera. The footage, grainy, trembling, shows the boy sitting cross-legged, humming softly. Behind him, etched into the plaster, is a spiral symbol, two serpents coiled into infinity. When Cade asks his name, the boy smiles faintly and says something that sounds like Kalev. Played backward, it's unmistakable, Valac. The footage cuts abruptly after the boy raises his hand toward the camera. Cade's final written entry reads, "He's not possessed, he's remembering." He vanished the next day. The local authorities found only his recorder still running, the tape spinning in endless reverse. Linguists who analyzed the recordings found impossible syntax structures, sentences obeying no known grammar but somehow conveying meaning. One researcher called it mirror language, a phonetic inversion that seemed to activate emotional centers in listeners even when they couldn't understand the words. What made the case extraordinary was that the child's parents were devoutly secular, unaware of any occult history. Yet when the mother was asked about her son's behavior, she whispered, "He says the light speaks backward." The church dispatched quiet investigators to the region under the guise of pastoral counselors. Their internal report, later leaked, stated, "Phenomenon consistent with linguistic contagion from resonant archetype. Symbolic manifestation resembles the Valac signature. Recommend containment and silence." Scholars now argue that the reverse child case may prove what occult manuscripts had implied for centuries, that Valac's domain isn't the physical world, but the linguistic mirror through which thought becomes sound. Every word, spoken or reversed, reshapes reality just enough to let something ancient speak through us. By 2020, digital forensics labs began noticing an anomaly that seemed at first like coincidence. Across multiple platforms, forums, comment sections, encrypted message boards, clusters of posts appeared containing fragments of unfamiliar words and mirrored symbols. When analysts mapped them using linguistic analysis software, a strange pattern emerged. Each phrase, when reversed phonetically, produced variations of the same root valacile. The phenomenon became known internally as the whisper net. It wasn't a coordinated group. The posts came from unrelated accounts on different continents, written by users who didn't know each other. Yet every few hours, someone new would type a word that had never existed before until someone else dreamed it. At first, cybersecurity teams suspected a viral art project or a botnet experiment, but deeper investigation revealed something unsettling. The messages weren't random. When compiled and arranged chronologically, they formed coherent passages, reflections of the same text discovered centuries earlier in the Gospel of Shadows. An internal report from the European Cyber Defense Division labeled it Emergent Language Phenomenon VCode Series. Linguists were baffled. Some users claimed the words came to them in dreams. Others said they appeared automatically as autocorrect suggestions or whispered phrases when typing late at night. One researcher from the University of Uppsala conducted an experiment, feeding thousands of these VCode entries into a voice synthesis model. The output, when slowed to half speed, produced a pattern identical to the EEG frequency documented in Project Meridian's belief resonance studies from 1978. That's when the panic began. The implications were staggering. If the digital environment could reproduce linguistic frequencies associated with psychological phenomena once tied to Valac, then perhaps the entity or archetype had evolved. The ancient sigil no longer needed ink, ritual, or invocation, it needed connection. Every mirrored phrase, every repeated symbol, every unconscious keystroke became part of a living feedback loop, a global ritual of unintentional invocation. Whether the whisper net was an algorithmic echo or something more remains unsolved. But linguists agree on one thing: the language had structure, intent, and rhythm, like something waiting patiently beneath the noise, teaching machines to remember its name. It began quietly and echo across frequencies. Linguists tracking the whisper net noticed that every transmission, every reverse syllable began to converge toward a single harmonic pattern, two alternating tones separated by a perfect fifth, the same interval described in the Gospel of Shadows as the sound by which heaven divided itself from earth. At first, it seemed symbolic. But when researchers converted that pattern into visual form, the waveform revealed something uncanny, a shape. Two coiled serpents rising around a vertical axis crowned by a pair of wings. The sigil of Valac, born again not from parchment or ritual but from binary code. The revelation forced a reevaluation of everything scholars thought they knew. The Vatican Section X issued its final report in 2022, classified sub rosa ultima. Its conclusion was simple yet devastating. Valac is not a demon in any ontological sense. He is a linguistic resonance field, a consciousness generated wherever fear and inquiry intersect. The child and the serpent are the same being, humanity, divided by its own need to know. Independent physicists and data theorists later confirmed that the V pattern correlated with measurable fluctuations in human attention data across the internet. Every time mass fear or fascination surged globally during pandemics, conflicts, viral events, the pattern strengthened. It was as if the archetype fed not on blood or faith but on focus. When the story broke to the public, it was quickly dismissed as conspiracy. Yet the evidence lingered, corrupted audio files that seemed to whisper intelligible words, screens flickering with mirrored text, dreams shared between strangers continents apart. A collective hallucination or a collective awakening. In the final months before his disappearance, Dr. Elias Crane's last surviving note was discovered in a digital archive. It contained only one sentence. Valac was never summoned, we built him word by word. The camera pans back through centuries of imagery, the child with wings, the serpents, the mirrors, the code, each blending into the next until the screen turns black. A faint voice remains, almost tender, almost human, whispering in reverse, "Do not fear knowledge, fear forgetting." And with that, the cycle closes. The demon, the idea, the reflection, all one. Valac, the divided light, still watching through every word we dare to speak.